It's off. All right. Hopefully we're ready to start tonight, and we'll see if we can get through all this material once again. And so thank you for coming again. So this is tonight is going to be about early American church history, and we'll get started with some of this. So the first thing I always like to do is do kind of a little thing, and this one tonight is learning, and it's from the Old English word leorian, meaning knowledge acquired by a systematic study. And so my question is, what have we learned? So your assignment, your final assignment due at the end of the week is to send me a note or a text about one thing or more if you want that you've learned over the past 23 lessons. And so that's your thing, is just say, this was what I really was surprised and I really learned this. And so if you'll do that for me, I'll try to incorporate that into my final lesson so we can kind of talk about what we did. All right. Heard on the street this week, AB said, I think I'm a Zwinglian and would like more information on Zwingli's 6-7. And so if you remember that, and I think she actually just said, those are all the things that I was taught from when I was a young little girl. And so as we look through church history, that's what we'll find, is we will find there are things that you say, I relate to that. And we can relate to things all throughout church history, but it's not necessarily you're going to find anybody just like you. And if she went and looked at Zwingli's 6-7, then she could actually go back in there and go like, yeah, I'm not sure I buy that or not either. But, 6-7, there you go. All right, KJB, all right, said, was the combination of multiple denominations and separation of church and state good for Christianity? All right. So that's a very interesting question. We'll try to tackle a little bit of that tonight. And since it's an opinion question, you can say yes or no. Sometimes you just say it's a thing. And that's what we deal with, is there were things that happened throughout history. I know my brother-in-law made a statement about, well, the Council of Nicaea was really good. I think those guys had it all right. And I said, oh, really? Do you agree with this and this? And I started pointing out some things. He goes, maybe I don't have all the information right. And I said, you can go watch my lesson way back 20 episodes ago, and you can find out a little bit more about that. And so anytime that you get into some of that, you can make determinations and everybody can have their opinion. And some people will say, yes, it was a good thing. Other people might say, no, that may not have been such a good thing. Now, some of that's going to depend on what background you come from as well, too. If you came from a Church of England high church background, you're going to say, no, that wasn't good. If you come from a Catholic background, you might say, no, it ruined the church, and you could kind of go through that. And so you'll see that a lot of that depends on what it was, but was it good for Christianity in total? I would come back and probably say Jesus's final prayer was about the unity of the church. And so we'll just leave it right there. HD said, I want to hear more about the American church. You got it, Harold. Let's get started. What's on the docket tonight? Roots of American church history and early American church history. And that's where we're going to kind of camp out tonight. I will say that every week as I prepare these, I have to do a lot of background information. And as I told Jesse earlier, sometimes as I'm preparing, I don't know exactly what my goal is. In other words, where is this going to go? And I have to let the story begin to speak to me and also speak. And so that's what you get to hear is what I get from the research and everything. As I started this week out, I was pretty fuzzy thinking, well, okay, I don't know how this is going to go. And as I got through and got further and further along in the lesson, I thought, oh, this is how it all fits together. Hopefully I can explain that to you tonight and we can get cracking on that. Words of the day. Let's get Latin Logan out here. Denomination comes from the Latin denominatio, meaning a calling by anything other than the proper name. I'm letting people think about that for a minute or two, but that's where that name comes from. It's actually a division is what we would say, and that's where that comes from, but it's really calling something by other than its proper name. And I thought that was very interesting to get that from that ancient language. Ostentation, we will look for that word tonight. from the Latin ostentationem, if I pronounced that right. If I butchered it, then forgive me. Means showing, exhibition, or vain display. All right, so if somebody's ostentatious, they have a vain display or a showiness about them. And then Carolina, which you're obviously going to talk about Carolina tonight a little bit. That's from the Latin word Carolus, meaning free man. And so if you go back into early Roman times, basically Carolus meant that you were a free man, as opposed to being a slave or even a non-citizen. It became the feminine name for Charles or Carl, if you will, which I found that kind of interesting. So when you get to the Carolinas, you'll know kind of where that came from. Let's look at the American church today. So we'll kind of see where we're headed. There's between 200 and 1,500 distinct denominations, depending on how you categorize them and how you bunch them. And there's every flavor that you can imagine and everything else. So as you look at denominations calling something by other than its true name, Christianity, we call it a denomination. And so we end up with whatever you got out there. So, but that's, I thought it was interesting, between 200 and 1,500 denominations in America today. Protestants are about 45% of our population. Catholics, about 22% of our population. Other Christians like Eastern Orthodox, about 0.4%. And there are others, Coptics and some others like that. Others such as, well, there's others that are out there too that we won't get into, but that's, you could do so like Mormons or some of the, what I've always called a cult. There are others that are out there that are even a smaller percentage. Non-Christians in America, this was some survey that somebody did, 33% of Americans are non-Christian. They say, I don't belong to a church at all. So interesting little tidbit there. That 33% may also include Muslim, Jews, and but then a lot of people that are atheist, agnostic, whatever they want to call it, free will or whatever. I don't, whatever you want to get to. I also want to look at American time periods. And so I was looking at this because I said, okay, as we work through these last 3 lessons, what are the time periods that did? And so I did an AI search and came up with this. There was pre-Columbian, European colonization, and then you get into these other: American Revolution, Expansion Reform, Manifest Destiny, the Civil War and Reconstruction, Modern America, World War II, and post-war. And then it's labeled, this last one, the Information Age, and that was from the 1960s to today. And so I think pretty much everybody in this room would say you've lived in the Information Age. And I said, why did they call that the 1960s, right? Because that was the advent of television in terms of information and starting to get your information from those, as opposed to print media. And even before that, there was some radio, but by and large, when the 60s hit, that's when television hit in a big way, and that's where we get a lot of our information. So, and of course, we've moved into way beyond that now. Let's look at some of our North American European roots. Spain, that was the conquistadors. They were Roman Catholic Jesuits. And so when you look at Catholics in America, a lot of times you got to look back to what was going on, especially living in the Southwest. We have a very large Hispanic population, and a good number of those are Roman Catholic, and they would be of that Jesuit order most likely if they were going to adhere to one of the different denominations within Catholicism. The French, now those were trappers and fishermen, and they're Roman Catholic. They actually came through 2 different areas into what we would call America today. One would be up around the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence waterway, and then Louisiana, and going north up through the Mississippi. And so, and you'll see some of that. The Netherlands were Dutch Reformed, and they settled a good part, especially in an area we call New York, right? And so you see that come from there. Also Pennsylvania and some other areas, but that was Dutch. And if they came from that area, a lot of times they were Dutch Reformed. And then we have England. And England was Puritans, Anglicans, and Separatists. Now, if you would have asked me before I started studying this, what were the English people that came in, I would have said they were pilgrims. So that would have been it, or maybe Puritans, but that's not entirely true because it was actually very diverse. Uh, the Church of England was Puritan and then, if you will, non-Puritan in a sense of high church, that they were very loyal to the crown. And so you'll see that happening in here and a distinction in there. But then there were the Puritans. We're going to talk about them. There were also the Quakers, which we will talk about tonight. And then there were also from England, the Roman Catholics. And you'll see that under King James, basically, he started suppressing the Roman Catholics again. And he basically sent them to a place called Mary's Land after Mary's Queen of Scots. And so we'll see a little bit of that. So let's look at pre-Columbian indigenous. Before Columbus got here, right? The whole continent was full of what we would call today indigenous people. And here's a picture of them. And basically that goes all the way from North America all the way to the tip of South America, by the way. And there were probably between, and it's hard to get estimates on that, but they think between 50 and 100 million north to south, North America, South America, Central America, whatever you want to call it. About 10% of that, only 10% of that, was in the US and Canada. So you're looking at 5 to 10 million maybe in the US and Canada, probably even closer to the 5 million. Mexico had about 33%, and you would call them Aztec Indians, where the Incas came from and something like that. Central America had another 12%, the Caribbean, and then the rest of that group is going to be in South America, believe it or not. And there was a huge population in South America, Amazon River Basin, and still are indigenous Americans all throughout the American continents, by the way. By 1700, there were only 10 to 20 million. All right. Reason? Europeans came over and we brought disease with us. And various diseases, smallpox and cholera and some others, that they did not have immune systems, and it wiped them out. Even the plague. We brought rats over with us, introduced these rats with fleas in them, and it wiped out. You know, you look at that and you go like, you know, if you think about Columbus, 1492, right? So within 200 years, you're going to see about 90% of the population just disappear, 80 to 90%. And that actually comes into play in what happens in church history, believe it or not. I'm not going to get to it tonight, but when you talk about manifest destiny, a big part about manifest destiny was God is clearing out this world for us to take over. All right? He's clearing out these pagans for us to move in as Christians. Kind of a interesting take on that. United States by that time probably had between 1 million and 2 million people, reduced down just along with everybody else. So you have a vast continent, all right, that's out there. Pagan religions, basically they worship nature gods, and that was kind of it. And still do to this day, by the way. I worked for a Native American company when I was in New Mexico, and the guy that was the CEO of our company actually even took a year off, and he was a Pueblo Indian, and he took a year off, had to go take a vow, and he had to spend a whole year up on their sacred mesa in New Mexico. So if you think of New Mexico and these flat top mesas, if you go to the Acoma Pueblo, up on top, they have a Pueblo village up there that dates back 1200, I think, is when they go back, maybe even beyond that they can actually go back, and that village has been there for about 800 years. All right, so that colony has been there. So he descends from this tribe, and one of his duties as part of his religious duties is he needed to go out and he needed to pray for his people. He couldn't he couldn't cut his hair. He had to live up on the mesa. There's no running water up there. They bring water up. There's no fuel other than if you gather some wood. So they bring fuel up, but he does that, and he's got to live with, I think there's 4 of them. And every day they have to go out and trek into the mesa, one north, south, east, and west, and pray for their people. All right, and offer prayers up, and they burn sagebrush and some other things, and they have some rituals like that. And obviously, no sexual relations. And I had an Irish boss that said, I think I would change my religion if that was the case. And so anyway, so that's what still goes on today in America, is you will still find these basically this pagan religion, not worshiping idols. They're worshiping Father Sun, Mother Moon, and everything else you can imagine. And then we're going to get this guy named Cristoforo Colombo. Now, I'll ask a quick question for the people here and online. You can answer it. I don't know if Jesse will spot it. Where was he from? Yeah, he was from Italy. Somebody said Portugal. That's wrong. He was an Italian. All right. And the name ought to give it away. And I always thought he was from Spain. He set sail from Spain, right? So why did he set sail from Spain? He wanted, and there's some reasons for this, he wanted to go find a new route to the Silk Road. The fall of Constantinople in 1452 by the Ottoman Turks, when they took that over, that closed the Silk Road. And obviously silk was coming from there, as well as spices and other goods. And so there was a big trade that all of a sudden, kind of like shutting down the Gulf of Hormuz today, it stopped. It stopped world trade. And so there was a big thing going on there. And so he and others working through their maps. And by the way, just to fix this, he did not think the world was flat. All right. He thought it was a lot smaller than it is. And he estimated that he could sail to the west, going around the Western Sea, all the way to the Indies and in India. And so that's what his goal was, to set out on that. He took that before multiple rulers, all right, including England. He took it to obviously Spain. He took it to the Italians, and he's saying, I'm going to go find this out. Well, Ferdinand and Isabella were the Queen Ferdinand, King Isabella. If you're familiar with them, they're big things in church history that we run into. They agreed to fund his trip because they were afraid somebody else was going to do it. They were afraid somebody else was going to fund his trip, and if they did, if they found that out for England, then all of a sudden England is going to get the bonanza of that trade to the India going west. And so they decided to fund it. And so everybody's familiar with the story. All the guys jump on these little ships. They're about the size of this room from wall to wall, and set sail for India. And they didn't quite make it, did they? Now, my title on this slide was God, Glory, and Gold. And let's see if he hits all these things. They promised him to become Admiral of the Ocean if he's successful. And part of that, they would give him 10% of all revenue from any colonies established. Can you imagine how rich Christopher Columbus would be today? If he was getting 10% of all revenue, it'd just be unbelievable. Thing is, he never found India. He actually made, and I think I put this in here, he actually made 4 trips to the Americas. He never admitted it was something other than something before India. He called it the West Indies and these others, but he kept looking for India. He was convinced he was going to find that route. And so that's one of the things that he was done. He was, the glory part of that thing was there. He was a Roman Catholic millennialist and apocalyptist, if you can say that. He thought if by his efforts he could bring on the second coming of Christ. And what he wanted to do, and he said this in his logs, he wanted to acquire gold, there you got the gold part, in such quantity that the sovereigns will undertake and prepare to go conquer the Holy Sepulchre. That was the place, the church of Jesus' birth, all right? And hope to deliver Jerusalem from the Muslim lands, because that was the other threat. So fall of Constantinople, you have them, the Ottoman Turks that are still making their way west, and all these European emperors and kings are saying, we've got to stop that because we don't want them to take over us. And plus, Ferdinand and Isabella had just ousted the last of the Muslims from Granada in Spain. So they were all about, let's take the Muslims out. And so that was one of the things. And his other thing was his hope to deliver Jerusalem from Muslim lands. Yeah. Eventually he made 4 trips looking for the Indies, as I've already said. Never did claim to have found those, never established a colony, so he got 0. So what he missed out on, just establish a colony, Columbus, all right? So who goes in instead of him? Well, we have the Spanish conquistadors. And so now we're going to get into some different things. This is a church in the background there that looks very, very much like many churches you'll find, especially in the Southwest. If you go into Mexico, and you can find these in downtown Albuquerque, basically. And that's a very Spanish style church. So a guy named Cortez in 1519, so put that about 20 something years, he goes and he conquers the Aztec Indians. And as he makes his landfall there, he sees one of the Indians and he sees a gold earring in his ear. And he says, "Come here, let me have a look at that. Where did you get that from?" And he says, "Oh, we got all kinds of stuff back over here in the woods or in the jungle." And so guess what the little guys with pointy hats did? They took a very small band of, I think it was around 300 or maybe 3,000. I don't know that right. And they go in and they conquer the Aztec chief and beat an army of like 15,000 that he had, because they had guns. And when they fired those guns and the smoke went this way and the bullet went that way, all those Indians said, "We give up." All right, as you can imagine. And so they did several things. As they enslaved the indigenous population, and the conquistadors began exploring the Americas. All right, now they're starting off in Mexico. You think about that. Now they got the West Indies as well, but they're starting off in Mexico. So they had Spanish mission styles. And so you see Franciscan priests, and I'm pretty sure there was Jesuits that came along with them too. I think I said that because Franciscans are going to be more with Portugal, so I may have put that slide wrong. But the Jesuits are going to be very much Spanish. And they established the Spanish mission system. If you go down to San Antonio and that area, there's actually a mission trail. And you can go from place to place, including one that we know as the Alamo. That was one of the Spanish missions, and they ran those things from Mexico all the way up as they were exploring north. All right. Their goal, these priests were to teach Christianity, European agriculture, music, and architecture, and all that to natives. And so that's what their goal was as they're going through that, because they're going along with the soldiers, and they will try to enforce these things. They combined military authority with religious instructions, and remember who has the guns, and we're going to teach you something. And so that's kind of the way they went in. And if you go into New Mexico today, and I worked with the Pueblo Indians quite a bit, they are about 90% Catholic, if you want to call that. Now, and they do some things that are still a little crazy in my mind. I had one friend named Ray, and he became a deacon of the Catholic Church, and every week he had to go around his Pueblo and knock on doors and tell people they got to go to church. All right. Now, how they lived in their life was a whole different story, because might not pass our morality test, if you will. All right. They were under the authority of the Catholic and a Spanish crown as they went through that. And Florida they had the first Catholic Mass in Pensacola, Florida in 1513. So that's not that long after Columbus had touched foot in the West Indies. They expanded to Texas, New Mexico, and California. Why do you say New Mexico? Because they went right up the Rio Grande Valley. And so that's when you have Coronado, and he's going through there, and there are stories that where Kathy and I lived in New Mexico, we were basically in the campground of Coronado's army of about 20,000 conquistadors. And there's some stories there. I'll just leave that alone. And that California, they went out west and found the Pacific Ocean, started going north, and then you see all the Spanish missions up there, and think of all the names of the towns. All right, what are some of the towns that you find in California? San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and you can go on and on and on. And they all have these Spanish names because of these conquistadors that went up through there. And they went through Florida too. And so you even look in Florida and you're going to get some of that, even though that kind of gets turned around a little bit. The first recorded baptism was in a place called San Juan Capistrano, famous for its swallows. Yeah, the swallows of San Capistrano. So just a few little interesting things there. And so that's basically where Catholicism in America is going to get its foothold, even though it's going to change in a lot of other ways as history moves on. The French colonies in the late 1600s. This is going to be primarily up north, but you're going to also get one down south. But they were exploring the St. Lawrence River, Louisiana. All right. Everybody know where that is over here, just a little bit further east? Named after Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King. And so they named that after him and they claimed this. And what happened with that is as they started exploring the Mississippi River, they said, we're going to claim the whole river, which runs all the way to Minnesota, and any tributaries. So now you get, what other rivers you get? Everything on this side of the Rockies and all the way up to pretty good ways west, and the land on both sides of all those rivers. So they basically have this whole huge thing. And if you ever looked at the map, kind of goes up like that. And that's what is going to get bought. And you see French name colleges like Detroit, all right, St. Louis after St. Louis, or Louis, Baton Rouge, very French name, New Orleans, all right, and you can go through that. And we get a French Catholicism gave us some things such as Mardi Gras, all right, and so that's celebrated there. Bastille Day, which you don't hear a lot about that, but that is a French thing. And then they also gave us Cinco de Mayo, and that's because they lost to Mexico. All right? And so that actually is something that the French gave us by losing to the Mexicans back then. All right. They primarily were Jesuit priests, and they were less interested in missionary efforts, and they were more interested in establishing churches. So what that means is they're not trying to evangelize the natives, all right, where the Franciscan, I think I did get that right, Franciscans were the ones trying to evangelize the natives. These guys said, no, we're just going to build a church here and all the good Catholics will come to church. And so they did that for the explorers and those that were doing that. About 60 years after Columbus, you start to see this map. And the green area is New Spain and New Granada down there, the West Indies. That's all under Spanish control. You see the orange is way up north, and that's the French. That's New France. And then as you continue looking down there, you're going to see the English or the blue areas, and they kind of spotted there on the upper east coast all the way down to Carolina. And then the Dutch have a little area cut out right in the middle. All right. You cannot talk about American religion without talking about European religion. Why? Because that's where we all came from. All right. Other than what I've already talked about, the indigenous, nope, most of us in here and probably in the audience are European background. So back in the old country, let's talk a little bit about the Puritans. That was a movement. So you think about the Church of England has split away from the Catholic Church, but they did that basically in leadership, if you will. They didn't change much of anything else. The king was now head of the church. They had the Archbishop of Canterbury. That would have been their version of the Pope, still that way today. But they didn't change much of anything from what the Catholics would have done, other than they would allow the king to annul his marriage. And so this movement that's Protestant fed was to purify the church, and that's where they became calling them Puritans. And so you see and I'll see if I can get it right, not Anglicans, not Angelicans, Anglicans, all right, and then you have Puritans, even though the Puritans would say that they were part of the Church of England. So both of them are part of the church, but you have kind of this whole different view. The Anglican are going to be very much the lords and everything like that. They're going to be the upper class, the ruling class. The Puritans are going to be the common folk. All right, so that's a way to think about that a little bit. And so you can see some things going on, but they are still considered one church because they're under the rulership of one authority, being the crown. So you have that. Now, the Puritans were guided by a very sober life of Scripture. They had no luxury or, word of the day, ostentation. They were not showy. And so while you think of Puritans, a lot of times you think of what they would dress would be black and white. And that's pretty it. Simple dress. And so you'll look at that, not showy at all. They rejected the Book of Common Prayer, which was a true Anglican thing, was the Book of Common Prayer. They said, no, we don't need that. We have the Bible. And so that's one of the things they would look at. The Lord's Day was devoted exclusively to religious exercises and the practice of charity. Nothing else. You take the day off. Does anybody like that idea? And I know that my wife does. And she says, I want to practice the Sabbath, the Christian Sabbath, and that's to keep the Lord's Day devoted exclusively to religious practices and practice of charities, which I think that's wonderful and easy to say, hard to do, especially in our world. Drinking was okay, but not drunkenness, especially in ministers. All right, so Ben, you just got to go watch things there. You can drink, you just can't be drunk. So we got to look at that. Theater was something. Now you have to remember, this is coming out of the Elizabethan age, who advocated for theater. This is Shakespeare and all this other. These guys are going, no, no, no. It's licentious because there's immorality presented. And I want you guys to think about what you can get tuned in on a TV. Immorality, all right? And they also, the acting they said was basically the line is duplicity. So the immorality was depicted in that, and nothing has changed in that at all, by the way. So in some ways, the Puritans had a very, very good thing. And part of it is they want to focus back on the Lord. Elders or presbyters were the leaders of the church, not bishops. All right, so they kind of wouldn't acknowledge them. And then the church should be looked to Scripture as its constitution. And that being said, then the church should be the civic rulers. Now, how's that going to go over the king? Not too well. So when they have this thing in Europe called Parliament, Parliament a lot of times had the Lords, right, the House of Lords, and then you had the House of Commons. The Commons was, by and large, Puritans. All right, and by this time, that's what's going to go on. They became very rigid in their belief, all right, and practices. So it went from one of this is an ideal to you got to do this. You better conform. And it's going to be very rigid, and you'll see that. Another group was the Separatists, and these were Puritan independents. And maybe you've heard of them, or maybe you haven't. It's going to play into what happens in America, though. And they advocated the church, each church should be independent of other churches. All right, now that may sound familiar to people, is every church stands on its own. They had a guy that was an independent, a separatist named John Smith, and he was an Anglican priest. And as we go on, he established an independent church, and thus it was illegal. He's going to get in trouble for that. And so he, in 1608, his congregation fled to Amsterdam and established the First Baptist Church. Not the First Baptist Church, the First Baptist Church, if you will. All right. And kind of interesting like that. So like, okay, so that's kind of where that comes from. There's going to be another guy that's going to help out with that. He read, and this is something that we don't want Ben to do, he read in Hebrew and Greek text and then translated as he preached. He said, no, we don't go with translations. We got to go back to the original. So he would read it, which was amazing to me. And that he became convinced that infant baptism was not valid. And so what he did was he baptized himself, took a bucket and a ladle, poured it over his head, and baptized himself. And so he was called a self-baptizer. And that's part of where they got into the thing when they went to Amsterdam. They're baptizing people because the first guy he baptizes is the next church member. And so he actually baptized them by pouring. He adopted a lot of Mennonite views on oaths and pacifism and everything else. And so he's got a follower who disagreed with that. All right. And so a First Baptist church split like no other, a tradition like no other. And that's not just First Baptist, by the way. So we get our roots for these church splits back in England. And so this was one of the first ones. A guy named Thomas Helwys. He was a lawyer who had financed their flight to Amsterdam. And so he basically says, I disagree about this baptism and the taking of an oath. I think we need to fight and we need to do it right. He returned to England and founded another Baptist church. And so now you have two different Baptist churches. Now, the Baptist churches were not unified in everything. They had disagreements on Arminianism and Calvinist. And the General Baptist were Arminian and the Particular Baptist were Calvinist. Kind of strange names. There were a lot of other separatists or dissenters. And I want to share with you a list of, and these are legit, these are all groups. You can go fact check me if you want and see if you can find any of these. There were the Barrowists, the Behemoths, the Brownists, the Diggers, the Familists, Fifth Monarchists, Grindletonians, the Levelers. I like this one. Muggletonians. I think J.K. Rowling borrowed something. Philadelphians, not associated with the city of Beverly. The Quakers, which we're going to take a closer look at. Ranters, Sabbatarians, Seventh-day Sabbatarians, which, by the way, is where you're going to get Seventh-day Adventists. Seekers, 1620s, and then the Socinians, all right, 1662. Now, if the Baptists don't take hold and the Muggletonians take hold, you would have the first Muggletonian church, right? Kind of interesting that you get these things, and these kind of basically faded away. They get absolved into other groups, or they have a short life, maybe a few congregations, and then they're done. So that's okay. Well, I got a comment going. You're looking at the Grindletonians too? Yeah. It just, when you go and read this stuff, you go like, I cannot believe how modern we look at these things, and we get J.K. Rowling, and she has Muggletonians, and she has Grindles, doesn't she? Yeah, in there too. And who knows what will come out of this. So next thing is I want to just take a back step, and this is the thing that gets real, I don't know, crazy to me, because we are so familiar with this, but English royalty. King James I, he lived from 1566 to 1625. So right in the time that Columbus was discovering America and these early settlements, he reigned from 1603. So Queen Elizabeth had died in 1603, and he basically takes her. And I think his actually reign may have started in 1604. Now, at 13 months old, he became King James VI of Scotland. All right, and he is from Mary, Queen of Scots. All right, that's, I think I got that right. Somebody can fact check me on that. I'm not going to get all this right. All right, in 1603, he's crowned the King of England and Ireland as King James, basically King James, and it was not the first, because they don't start to number them until you get the second guy in there. The Church of England was moving away from Calvinism, all right? Then I'm talking about the Anglican, the high church, is moving away from that, and it's becoming more liberal. And the Puritans, the common folks, if you will, they had a fear that they were going to return to Calvinism. He was raised in Scotland, and Scotland was hugely strong with Calvinists and Puritans, all right? And he hated them. All right? He was raised by them, and he hated them, and so he was raised as a Protestant, and he hated these guys. So, and then also this thing that you may remember this, the gunpowder plot. There was a guy named Guy Fawkes, and he was going to try to blow up the king and Parliament all at the same time. Rented a storage thing that just happened to be under the Parliament building. And he created what was known as crypto-Catholicism. All right? And I actually went and fact-checked this, and that is a thing. And that's basically, it comes from King James' suppression of the Catholics, and it's those that say one thing and do something else. So they would say they're not Catholic, but they would go practice Catholicism. And so that's a crypto-Catholic. And so we also have what is it? They call them Creasters. All right. They go to church on Christmas and Easter. And I just thought, I like crypto-Catholicism. Who would have thought about that? Anyway. All right. He was an advocate of the established Church of England. So think of the high church. And he would say, without bishops, there is no king. He did not have the support of Parliament, because most of Parliament was Puritans, and the bishops were Anglican. All right, so you kind of get that division in there. And he say, without bishops, there is no king. Now remember that phrase, because we'll come back to it later. And so he begins a campaign to purge all his basically nonconformist enemies. He starts finding them. He exiles them. That's going to be Puritans, Catholics, and anybody else, separatists, anybody else that disagrees. All right. And so he's also known, there you see that, anyway, for the authorized version of the Bible. In 1604 was when he initiated that, and 1611 it was published. We know it as the King James Version. Still available on your phone right now, coming from 400 years ago, basically. And so just pretty amazing. It was an amazing translation then, not so much now. And I won't get into some of that. There gets some other things like that. Now let's go a little bit further east over onto the continent. In 1555, so this is stepping back, there was the Peace of Augsburg. And basically, the Peace of Augsburg was trying to make peace between the Catholics and the Protestants. And they basically said, here's Catholic territories and here's Lutheran territories. And you guys are okay over here as Lutherans, you guys are okay as Catholics, quit fighting. And so that was the Peace of Augsburg, if you will. And somebody's going to mess that up. It's going to be my favorite guy, Calvin, or Calvinism. They began spreading into the Catholic territories. Not necessarily a bad thing, but they're going to evangelize the Catholics. Now, the Catholics don't take that too well, and so they start a fight, and it turns into the 30 Years' War, and that began in 1618. All right, and that's going to have a play about what happens to America. So this 30 Years' War, starting in 1618, which means it's going to end in about 1650. All right, and as you'll look at this thing, but in the 30-Year War, there were about 4.5 to 8 million people that were killed. That's not just soldiers, by the way. They, going in to enforce their religious beliefs, would kill men, women, kids, just kind of like we studied some time ago about the Cathars, and how they just went in and they'll wipe out a whole town. And that was a pretty sad moment in European history. The Holy Roman Empire at the same time, which was the Habsburgs, and so now you think of the Austro-Hungarian, but they also had Spain and the Dutch, and they're fighting with the French, all right? And so that wasn't necessarily a religious war, that's more of a territorial and who's really in rule. And then you also have the Ottoman Turks moving west, as I've already mentioned, and they're coming into points much, much further west, all the way into like Bulgaria and some others. And it's not far from starting to head down through Italy and some other places as well. And by the way, they had taken over a lot of the Mediterranean islands, such as Malta or some places like that. And so it was a good time to check out that new country across the pond. All those things, all that pressure, and what do you have across the pond? You have a new territory. You have places that you can go to. So let's talk about the colonization of America. All right, and I need to speed up a little bit. 1579, Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, by the way. That's amazing to me that he would do that. And he lands out near San Francisco, just north of there in a place called Point Reyes. There's the Drake Bay. And he sees this thing, plants the flag in it, and claims New Albion for England. And basically, New Albion was anything from the west coast to the east coast. All right, and that was it. He didn't know what was beyond, and but he just claimed it all. In 1600, think about this, 100 years after that, there were about, let me get this right, there were about, 1492, okay. Anyway, the thing I said 350, that must be 350,000 Europeans. They were Spanish, Mexican, Mexico and Caribbean, South America, and the Newfoundland fishing villages, St. Lawrence River, English up in that area. By 1700, 100 years later, there's something wrong with that. I don't know what my numbers are off on this, but Europeans, no, and it goes to 250,000, basically, and then there's about 1 million to 2 million natives. Might fact check my numbers on that. What I'm trying to illustrate is there was a lot of growth in 100 years, all right, to 250,000. A lot of this is people making a very hazardous voyage across the Atlantic, all right? And then by 1800, another 100 years, 5.8 million. That includes the natives, by the way, which are getting to be a percentage of that now. By 1900, 76 million people in America. Now, how's the church going to handle all that as we move along? And by the way, our last census, 281 million in 2000, and we've already grown another 50 million people in 20 years. And we're continuing that growth. So that's the colonization of America. So you're going to see this thing grow rapidly, and it grows a little crazy in terms of church. Jesse's fact checked me. All right, got anything?
Between a few hundred and a few thousand.
So 1,600, a few hundred people. Yeah, because, well, yeah, that's right. Because, yeah, the Mayflower didn't come until 1620, maybe before. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So even though Columbus had done that anyway, so you get the picture on that. Virginia, let's talk about, I want to kind of hit the colonies. That's what I want to do next. And so we're going to run through this because I think this gives an illustration of a couple of things. 1607, Jamestown. All right. And that was the first little colony named after King James. All right, good. What was Virginia named after? Elizabeth. Now, why? Because she was the Virgin Queen. All right. And that was where you get Virginia from. The goals of this colony, by the way, so the English are sending this over. Number one goal, stop the Spanish expansion. You have to think about European stuff now, and Spain and England were battling. You know, when they weren't marrying each other, they were fighting each other. And so that's going on, and they see this is going on, and they see Ferdinand and Isabella bringing back shiploads of gold and being able to fight these battles, and they say, we got to go get a piece of that action. We need to stop that expansion, so let's send our own people over there. One was to establish trade with the Indians. All right, now, Indians were not going to be, they're still thinking West Indies and India, but they're not going to have much to trade for them, really. But they did have agriculture, and tobacco grew really well in Virginia. And so guess what's a cash crop now? And we got a new thing we're going to hook Europe on. And so now we got tobacco going on in a big way. Religion was the established Church of England, by the way. And I'm talking about the high church because this fit in well, because they will start bringing in slaves. And now you have the lord of the area, if you will. They didn't call him that, but the owner and the people that worked for the owner. And so it was the established Church of England. Virginia was not established for religious freedom or religious expansion. All right, so that's something to keep in mind, because a lot of times we get in our mind that all these people came over because they were suffering. No, not Virginia. It was a money thing and political thing. But while there, let's attempt to enforce Puritan principles, because the Puritans came with them. And so you would be required, if you were a colonist then, to go to worship twice a day, strict observance of the Lord's Day, like we said, and stern punishment for profanity and immodest dress. So you see that idea coming in, and they would try to impose that stuff. Now, they didn't have a real good success in Virginia with that. They did in some of the towns and stuff, but if you got outside of the city, if you go to Williamsburg today, you can do reenactments. And we went a number of years ago, and they had a reenactment of a trial, and they put landowners. You had to be a landowner. And so they put these men that owned property up in this jury, and then they brought before them people and the thing. So they brought this lady up, and they just randomly picked her out of the audience, and they said, what religion are you? And she says, I'm Catholic, which is wrong thing. So, well, we're going to fine you 10 cents, and you need to change from being a Catholic over to being this, because that's what you do. So interesting thing that's really delightful to go see if you ever get up that direction. Let's move around outside of Virginia. And if you look at that map behind her, I put the words over there, but you look at these countries, they just kind of went, or these colonies, they went out west. It's just like, we got from here, and we're going that west, and we're going this far north. And so they don't look a whole lot like what we would notice, but that is North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. But Mary's land was in honor of Queen Mary, and it was a place for English Catholics to free the persecution that was actually happening in England. So now we're giving them an opportunity, 1634, so you start seeing that reign of King James, and the other kings are going to come in. Cecil Calvert was the second Baron of Baltimore. And so now you know of a town up there called Baltimore, Maryland, right? A lot of Protestants settled in Maryland, so it wasn't just Catholics. It was a place for Catholics to go, but they had a lot of different Protestants that went there too. And in 1649, they had an act concerning religion, and it granted tolerance for Trinitarian Christians, which would have included Catholics and any other Puritans, whatever else. But if you were a Jew or you were Muslim, it had no tolerance for that. And so very much still exclusive on that, but you see a little bit of religious freedom on there. In the Carolinas, the Church of England was the official religion. The Huguenots from France made a big play over there, and also the Quakers, which we'll talk about in a minute. 1732 was Georgia. Now, Georgia was interesting. That's late to the party. You look at 1732, and that's way, way, way past some of these other 100 years as part of the colony. And they had a royal charter that was granted the liberty of conscience. All right? Think about what Martin Luther said. It says, I cannot allow me to betray my conscience. Here I stand on the scriptures. And that was granted to all settlers except Catholics, by the way. So, because it was a royal charter of English, all right? And so that's why you would have that if you're Catholic, go up to Maryland. All right, New England, and you see these little towns up here, and there's cities that are there. A few things about this. The Plymouth Colony, everybody's familiar with that. 99 people originally, dwindled down to 50 within a year, so a lot of people didn't make that. It was a tough little place to get your foothold. But then another group called the Massachusetts, there was a whole name for this that I didn't print out, but they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There were 400 people originally in that one. It expanded to 2,000 within 2 years, 20,000 by the mid-1640s, all right? So about another 5 years. And then it had Puritans, Quakers, Baptists. They're all coming into Massachusetts. New Hampshire, yeah, they happened. They actually split. New Hampshire actually split off from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They just were expanding out because of territory. Basically, they needed more territory. Colony of Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, which, by the way, is still the official name of Rhode Island. All right, is Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations. A little factoid you may have not known there. Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he came down here, and he's a Quaker, by the way, and we'll talk about Quakers. And one of the things is he practiced religious tolerance, separation of church and state, and a complete break from the Church of England. So he's a separatist that you get in there, but he's also a Quaker, and we'll talk about him, and we'll talk about Quakers in a little bit more. The Connecticut Colony, there's a guy named Thomas Hooker, who I think was the one that established the Yale University. Is that in Connecticut? Anyway, and he was a Puritan, and so you got Puritans that were established in Connecticut. The Middle Colonies, New Nederland. All right, we call it New York today. And it was Dutch Reformed, very heavy on Calvinist theology, and it also practiced Dutch tolerance. They had the French Walloons, name that I had to go look up and say, what were these guys? Just another Protestant group. They had Germans that came in, Scandinavians, and Jews. And so in 1664, so about a little over 20 years after that was founded, the British changed, basically they bought it and changed the name to New York in honor of the Duke of York. And so that's their basis. Delaware was New Sweden, and they were Swedish Lutheran, Dutch Calvinist, Anglican in 1664. New Jersey was part of the New Netherlands, and they became part of New Sweden, and they were very similar to New York, but they were financially mismanaged by their governor. Nothing's changed. All right. The Brits changed the name to New Jersey, and it became, George Washington called it the Dutch Belt. All right. And so that's when, if you go back up in that area, you actually see quite a bit of Dutch names as well to some of the towns. So the American Church of England, all right, around 1650. So now we're well into the colonies. There is no bishop in America. So there's archbishop is in Canterbury, right? And you have bishops in England. There is no bishop in America. All right. The parishes would typically have 3 or 4 churches, and they were led spiritually by a rector that would be in charge of these. And it was governed by a vestry, which would have been a church committee. They had mandatory attendance. You would get fined if you weren't at church. All right. So they had real good church attendance. They had too few ministers over a widely scattered population, which is going to do what? 2 things. One, people are going to quit going to church. The other thing is they will start trying to figure things out on their own. Interesting part. They were urged to use the Book of Common Prayer to become devout at home, and people would use that. They wouldn't read the Bible. They would read the Book of Common Prayer and practice what's in there. And so as you go through this, you think about this, and so ministers from England would come over, and then they would go back. And so one minister said this: colonists were typically inattentive uninterested and bored during church services, according to the ministers who complained that the people were sleeping, whispering, ogling the fashionably dressed women, walking about and coming and going, or at best looking out windows and staring blankly into space. Kind of like people do in a church history class. So, so that was how it was. So when you brought that in and so you got to go to church every day, what happens? People were really not all that interested. They weren't all that devout. That is actually going to set things up great for the Great Awakening, as we'll talk about next week. Famous Puritans, John Winthrop, he described the colony as a city on a hill observed by the world and judged by God. That was kind of interesting, which modern day Boston is kind of what you get that area. Roger Williams also is a Massachusetts Bay Colony. He believed, and we've already talked about him, he believed in the inherent rights of individuals to worship according to their own conscience without interference from the state, called separation of church and state. Roger Williams. So if you want to talk about separation, whether it's a good or bad thing, it lays at his feet. Thomas Hookard, he joined the NBC in 1630s, but he wanted greater religious freedom, and so he left to go do Connecticut, and that's how that got started. He is considered the father of American democracy because of representative government, and he's the one that put that into place. John Davenport, he established the New Haven Colony for Puritans, wanting a stricter religious community, and he founded Yale University. Now, he was the one that did Yale. So, and that is in Connecticut, right? All right, so let's talk about the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. They actually take their name from John 15:14, you are my friends if you do what I command. And so we are a society of friends because we do what he commands. They were established by a guy named George Fox in England, by the way, so we're not in America, but they will have a much, much bigger play in America. They founded the Religious Society of Friends. They were English separatists, which Puritans and the Anglicans, I don't know why I can't say that. I see Angela over here, and I want to say Anglicans. So if I say that, I'm talking about Angela, right? Anyway, so they despised them. Separatists, the Puritans didn't like them because they weren't conforming to them, because they basically thought they had it right, and the Anglicans didn't despise them as well too. And so they were kind of looked down on by people. And George Fox, he began to preach publicly, and look at this, in marketplaces, fields, and sometimes steeplehouses. And he didn't care. He didn't have a church. He went and preached any place. And so if he was here today, he might have walked into our assembly and he would have started taking over the service and telling everybody his views on things. He was arrested numerous times for nonconformity and doing all this stuff. He was actually housed in the Tower of London for about 7 months, by the way. He told a judge to tremble before the authority of God. And so the judge turned right back to him, and he says he mocked him by calling him a Quaker, and that's kind of how the name stuck. And so, and there's also a story that says that they would, when they really get going, they'd shake a little bit, and that's how they're called Quakers. I kind of believe the judge story a little bit more than that one. He gained thousands of followers, including two formidable allies, Oliver Cromwell, which figures huge in British religious circles and politics and everything else, and William Penn, which we'll talk about William Penn a little bit further. So think about William Penn as a Quaker. 1682, his dad was an admiral, Sir William Penn, all right? So get this, you got to get this in place. Now, these are pretty small here, but we'll move on with it. He was the admiral of the entire British fleet. So his dad was a big dude, if you will, because you think about that. And William Penn was an Oxford student. His parents were sending him to the best school, and he became a Puritan while at Oxford. And he was unburdened by Puritan guilt and rigid beliefs. In other words, he was free from that. He was going to do that. So back in England, he became a Quaker, and his father had enough of that, and he kicked him out. Oh, I'm sorry. He studied with the Huguenots in France, came back, and that's where he basically got hooked in with some guys. He came back to England and became a Quaker. His father kicked him out. He spent 7 months in the Tower of London. All right. I think I said that about George Fox. It was William Penn. And he basically, one of his things that he said was, quoting King James, not the version, the king. No cross, no crown. All right, no bishop, no crown. He said, no cross, no crown. That's where the church is. And he had it out with the king a little bit. And King Charles granted him or his dad Pennsylvania and Delaware to offset debts that he owed to the admiral. So basically, we went into William Penn's name. So you think of where Pennsylvania and Delaware is today, all that's his. All right. And so he decides to pack up and begin what he called a holy experiment. And that was the freedom to practice religion. All the other colonies, by the way, there was an official state church, and they expected you to show up and go to church. And so that was that. And I am running right up against the clock, huh? 1704, Delaware split off to non-Quakers. That's how that gets started. If you want to see a great show, go find this old movie with Gary Cooper in it called Friendly Persuasion. You get that friendly persuasion. They have a great scene in there about their church service where they went in and did that. It's a fantastic show, very humorous. And by the way, it's a PG show, so good for families and everything like that. They believed in direct experience from God. They did not place scripture ahead of direct experience from God, which was very interesting, very different. And they believed the individual ability to be guided by an inward light. Now, there's going to get some things that are going to go on that you go like, oh, wow. They were known for simplicity, equality, teetotalism, didn't drink, pacifism. Those are some things that are hallmarks of Quakers. They avoided formal creeds and hierarchical structures. All right. All these things come into play. And they practice what's known as awaiting worship. Now, they'll do both even today. Awaiting worship would mean you go in, everybody sits in silence till the Spirit speaks to someone, and then they will allow them to speak. And by the way, women, men, they made no distinction. And so you have some of that if you were moved by the Spirit. And they rejected baptism by water because they said, no, you're going to start focusing on the water. You need to be baptized by the Holy Spirit, which is not that. And so they do not practice any, as far as I know, they do not practice any baptism today. And all that's going to come into play as we move through, because this is going to be people that help write our Constitution. All right. Some of their lasting legacy. Liberty Bell, right? Quakers did that. Democracy, Bill of Rights, U.S. Constitution, trial by jury, equal rights for men and women, public education. And I mentioned the Liberty Bell. Does anybody know any of our presidents that were Quakers? There was one about 50 years ago named Richard Milhouse Nixon. Yeah, which was kind of interesting. And I thought, okay, explain some things maybe. You're guided by some inward light that nobody else knows about. That's going to end tonight. Coming attractions, The Great Awakening. All right. There is a movie out currently, and it's called The Great Awakening, and it's about Benjamin Franklin and William Penn. And I have not seen the movie yet. I've seen the trailer. It looks fantastic, and I know some of our church members have seen it. They recommended it. Wednesday night, we're going to host a youth group here and make it a family thing to watch the movie. And I think Kane's going to arrange for some pizza and stuff. And so Wednesday night, look for your inbox. And if you're interested in doing that, you can go pay, there's $12 at the movie theater, or come here and watch it for free. All right. And so we're looking forward to that. We'll start the movie pretty quickly. So if you're late, you just missed the part, just come in quietly as everybody else is watching it. We're also going to talk about John Wesley, and then we're going to talk about the Great Reawakening, all right, which is the sequel to the Great Awakening, right? So they're always better than the first one, right? No. Okay. Anyway, and we're going to talk about the Restoration Movement. So some of the things to look forward to as we come along. Don't forget your assignment and thoughts, questions, or comments. And I'll turn to Jesse or anybody in here. Wait, get the mic for her.
So okay, I can't remember which group. Coming from the Mennonites, but where do the Mennonites come from?
The Mennonites are going to come in as a separate, and later actually, they didn't come in on the first colonists. They're going to come in much later, like in the late 1600s or in a further migration that'll come across. And they will settle into Pennsylvania for good reasons too, as you can just see, because Pennsylvania man, they took anybody, right? So, and by the way, his city that William Penn set up was called the City of Brotherly Love, Philadelphia. So, if nothing else, nothing online, don't forget your assignment again. Send me a text or an email or comment or something about what you've learned from our church history classes, because I've learned a lot. So, but I've had to do it quite a bit more. So that's it for tonight. And so God's blessings upon you, and we'll end.